Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Clockwork Gamedev show. My name is Keith Burgun. Hi Bricks Parts, I'm glad you're here because today we wanted to talk about, these are our three major topics for the day that we're going to talk about. I won't necessarily do them in this order, but these are the main things that we want to do. Bricks Parts had an idea about a sort of pure strategy game, I think was what he was calling it. And my inclination is that what Bricks Part was talking about was maybe something a little bit more in the realm of game theory than in game design. I think that maybe that's a good place to start, is sort of delineating the difference between game theory and game design. Because, I have some level of exposure to game theory. I'm not particularly interested in it. I don't find it particularly useful for game design. Let's get like a real definition of like game theory as a starting place. Like, I don't know, what does Wikipedia call it or something? How does Wikipedia describe it? So mathematical models of strategic interaction among rational decision makers, social science, logic, science, system science, computer science. Yeah. And there's a lot to learn in game theory. It's a huge topic. And I don't know that much about it. I know the basics. But generally speaking, from what I've been able to understand about game theory, it's pretty distinct from, let's put it two ways. Let's just really quickly talk about game theory and distinguishing it from game design. Game theory, sort of like I see it as more of a branch of mathematics than it's within math, I would say, or logic, right? It's sort of like branch of math or logic that can be applied in all kinds of different topics, right? Really to almost anything. I mean, you can game theory out almost any problem to some extent. Right? You can build these little game theory models and these little logic. It's similar to logic, like formal logic. Similar to formal logic. In fact, lots of formal logic is used in game theory. And then game design or game design theory is very distinct from game theory. I think it is more specific to, the process of building games for people to play. So it's a bit more, I guess, terrestrial or practical. Sort of. I mean, no, it's just more specific. It's not necessarily more terrestrial. It can be very theoretical. Just as theoretical as game theory, but it's a little bit. I think it's a little bit less abstract because it's more. It can get more specific because it's talking about a more specific kind of system. So something like game theory. The classic example that everyone knows is the prisoner's dilemma, and that's like super abstract, right? It's like literally everything's just represented by like ones and zeros. Defect or not, so it's like that sort of can apply to many different things, but it also doesn't hard apply to like anything, because every actual specific thing, and now that's true of all theory, right? So let's just talk about theory real quick. Like in this sense, we're not talking about like a scientific theory, but like but actually, that's kind of. I think game theory is more of a scientific theory, or or a branch of science. Let's say more of a scientific tool, Whereas game design or game design theory is more of an artistic tool, I would say. The process of building rule sets is, you know, I would say it's an art form, and art, of course, involves science. There's always science involved in art. Arguably, everything involves science to some extent, depending on how you define these terms. But I think that game design is more of a creative, artistic, or creative process tool, I guess. And creative, maybe interpretive. Or what's another word? Like, you kind of like have to use your own judgment in order to use these tools. Yeah. Let's see. So anyway, this is, I don't know that this is necessarily super necessary to talk about, but yeah, what is theory? The way that I think about theory, and when I talk about game design theory, the way that I talk about it is like, you know, frameworks or intellectual tools that can help us make, you know, help us reach our goals more quickly. That's pretty much how I see theory in terms of like in art, in music, and in game design. So game theory, in my experience, is too abstract, too mathematical, too generalized to be very helpful in game design. Now, I'd love to hear if some people out there are like, no, game theory is super useful and helpful to me as a game designer. That would surprise me, but I'd be interested to hear about that and why that was the case. What I think happens is, here's what I see happening. Let's just write game design theory for this. What I think happens here is we don't have a lot of game design theory, right? And so what ends up happening is we end up having to rely on tools from other disciplines. And that's what game theory is. Game theory has been around for a long time. I guess to argue, there's maybe some flexibility there in terms of when game theory first, you know, like people have been doing those kind of like thought exercises for a very long time. But it's been formalized for, I think, at least the last few hundred years, probably. Whereas game design theory, we don't have a lot of that. We've only started in the last like 30 years to even begin to make some of that, right? And so I think what happens is, so we end up relying, you know, leaning on a lot of existing frameworks and intellectual tools from other disciplines, even if they don't necessarily, you know, apply in a very specific way. Something like that. That's kind of how I see it, and that's why game theory comes up so much in game design theory. Also, obviously, the existence of the word game and the word theory. Like the idea of game design theory is itself, like, I don't hear a lot of designers talking about that. That's not something that we really value culturally, and I think that cultural value is going to have to come before we start really building that stuff up. So yeah. I mean, there's a thing here about like literacy and you know, yeah, it just comes back to the cultural values thing. Like, do we value the idea of developing intellectual tools and frameworks for building better rule sets or not? Yeah. So let's see. I want to just get this out of the way real quick, kind of. Maybe we'll put this in a box just to kind of put it aside, because it's a little bit of a sidebar, I guess. But I did want to talk about that because I think a lot of what Bricks Parts was talking about, and Bricks Parts, maybe you have some questions or comments or thoughts that that you think would be relevant to talk about. But I think that some of what you were talking about maybe would be better answered in the realm of game theory, which is not something I am an expert in at all. But I would recommend looking there for answers on what you were asking about. Because like, so for example, solution. Like, I'm a game designer. I don't deal with solution and whether or not something is like mathematically solvable or, practically solvable. I mean, all I care about is that, yeah, it's not practically solvable. For game designers, all we care about is that there's plenty of headroom, which means like, in a practical sense, meaning our players haven't come close to, or haven't seemed like they're coming close to solving the game. And you would notice, you would look for things like, are they doing the same thing over and over and over again and just winning no matter what? Obvious problems or signs of this kind of problem would be players using degenerate strategies. I don't know if that's a good word, actually. I think Sterling uses that word a lot, but it's a little weird. Let's say like using the same strategy. Well, I mean, actually, would be players never losing would be one very easy thing, right? That would be an obvious thing. If you saw that your players just were never losing the game, then you could say, well, it sounds like this player has solved the game. That, or at least that's likely the case. I mean, maybe they're just getting better constantly at like a rate that is outpacing the ELO, but that would be a different problem. Obvious signs of this kind of problem would be players never losing. Let's make this like a little bullet list guy here. Players ignoring, I don't know, large percentages of the strategy space. Yeah, that would be obvious signs that there's not enough headroom, which is similar to another way to put this is, games all kind of look the same. Let's say never or almost never losing. Okay, yeah, something like that. So that's all I care about with solution. Like there are these like more narrow definitions of solution that are more in the realm of game theory and math and like some of the like advanced AI kinds of topics. And like for a game designer, like I don't care about that stuff. It doesn't really implicate my work. Because I'm not designing for, some super AI. I'm not designing for some like Laplace demon. I'm not designing for even really like pros, like the top echelon of players. I'm not really designing for them. And I really don't think other game designers should either. And I think that mostly other game designers are not. I think that most, game designers should design for, as much as possible, all players, including the top. But most of all players are somewhere in the middle. They're intermediate, or there's like a median player. And I think you want to like lean your design into making sure that it's good for most players. And So maybe let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, this is not about randomness, but we'll get to the randomness when we talk about gem wizards. I think I need, Brickspart says, that's fair. I think I need to think more about this, but I don't really think play is going to be much different between what I would call a pure and strong strategy game. Okay. I don't know. I'm not sure. Do you want to say more about what those things are referring to? Oh, shoot. I lost my train of thought. What was I going to maybe write about? Next was not much right now. Think more about it. Sure, that's all good. Shoot, there was something I was just going to talk about. Can somebody remind me? Yeah, can't remember now. Super blanked out. So let's see. Solution. Right. Yeah. No, super blanked out. Lost it. Well, that's okay. Well, let's go move on to the next thing. Let's move on to randomness, which is what we all came here to talk about. That was supposed to be the main topic for today, was randomness. So now I've written a bunch of articles about randomness. This is kind of my biggest and it's from 2014. Very long time ago. 10, 15, almost exactly 7 years ago or 6 years ago, this article. But I think it's pretty good. And this one I talk about input and output randomness, and this whole thing. Now this is very much like if you also watched my 3-minute game design article or video on randomness. It's similar topic. It's similar. It's a similar layout. This chart I always wished that I had made. Someday I want to make a better version of this chart. But this is an interesting thing to talk about. Execution is a source of output randomness. I'm not sure if I must have talked about that somewhere. Let's see. Huh. Let me just look. Keith Burgun. This is how I do this. What is it? Execution. Oh, here we go. Yeah, apparently I did. Execution in strategy games should be called randomness. Oh, it wasn't even that long ago. It's like a year ago. So yeah, I can post this in the Twitch chat here if anyone wants to peep at that. Let's see. Let's read this paragraph here. The most common response to my claim that execution is a form of randomness is something along the lines of this. Execution isn't randomness, it's skill. The argument is that because you can get better at execution, it is therefore not random. Of course, you can also get better at shooting baskets, but on each individual shot, there is still variance and unpredictability. All you can do is increase your odds with training, right? It's an odds thing. It's not that, I suppose at some point you might get so good at throwing baskets that you do it 100% of the time. I think maybe that's technically impossible, but maybe that's, maybe that's arguable, and then at that point there would not be any randomness involved. But from a strategy game design perspective, that's no different from the fact that in XCOM, some of your soldiers have a better chance to hit because of their RPG stats, which could be framed as their training. Well put, me. I think a lot of the disagreement on whether execution should be considered randomness has to do with the particular aesthetics of different kinds of games, particularly strategy games versus sports. For example, in an FPS with strategy game elements, something like Overwatch, it feels like the execution is pretty central to the game. So to call it randomness feels wrong. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the essence of so many games is their execution. In Overwatch, like, it's all about the execution. So if you're calling the execution random in Overwatch or in a fighting game, it feels like you're just saying the whole game is just nothing but random. And it's, the thing is, like, I actually wouldn't say, I think it's sort of misleading, not maybe incorrect, but misleading to say that in a pure FPS, like just a pure deathmatch FPS, right? Like one-on-one, you and me in a room, we're shooting at each other, whatever, like old school Doom deathmatch. I think it's really like inappropriate not necessarily wrong, but it's just like inappropriate and misleading to say that that execution is random, because the whole purpose of the game is to sort of measure that execution through cycling this execution. Does the skill element make execution a better source of randomness than dice? No. So in the case of a strategy game, I actually think that makes it a worse source of randomness than dice. Because in a strategy game, if you do have randomness, you want that to be controlled by the system. You don't want players to just be able to just like grind out some skill and then come into the strategy game with some other, with some like extra power. It's like, it's kind of like in a game where there's like, pay to win type of game, and some rich guy comes and plays, and now he's just dominating everybody because he's got the most money in his bank account, regardless of like what's happening in the strategy game, right? Like I think Artifact had, when it first came out, people were making complaints like that, and plenty of pay to win kind of online games. So you want in a strategy game, you want to be testing the strategy. So there's going to be these weird deformations of like, oh yeah, there's all this strategy, but this guy, he really trained like headshotting. Like he's just so good at headshotting now. So that's like deforming the whole strategy space. He's basically dominating. He doesn't even really need to necessarily interact with the strategy space that much. Now there's other elements here. And I think that actually this is a good segue into the bigger, like newer topic, the newer way I'm kind of thinking about randomness in games in general. And it has to do with, this is also related, 3 types of bad randomness, 1 good one. So you have, we talk about input randomness and output randomness, which I think people understand. And then also these terms, which everyone hates, variable randomness or uniform randomness, which to me seem very natural as a non-math guy. And, I think that's one of the weird things about me as a game designer is that I'm not a STEM person at all. I come from art and music and creative fields. I actually I don't know like anything about math really. I'm very bad at math, and programming has been a nightmare for me. But yeah, so for me, coming from a creative background, the idea of variable randomness, which is, or how variable randomness is, which is like the range of possible outcomes, or how uniform it is. So like how much in sort of like probability studies, I think the way that they talk about this is like randomness with replacement or randomness without replacement. So we have these 4 types of randomness, but anyway, so what I came away in this article was uniform input randomness is kind of the best kind of randomness, generally speaking, and variable input and output randomness are both kind of they're both kind of bad because it might mean that you could just win a match because things just kind of went your way. You drew really good cards. You're getting a unequal amount of power distributed to you sort of randomly in each match overall. And that's going to be like adding noise to the signal of how well you understand the system. By variable, you mean there's a large variance based on it. Doesn't necessarily have to be a large variance, but yeah, the larger variance it is, the more variable it is, right? So 0 to 10 damage versus 5 to 6 damage would be an increase in the variability. Definitely 5 to 6 damage is pretty uniform, like overall. So like let's say you play like Advance Wars, for example, actually works that way, where the damage is in a range of 2 numbers, right? And so overall, once you play a whole match of Advance Wars, you tally up all those 5s and those 6s, right? How many times did I land a 6? How many times did I land a 5? And overall, it's gonna be pretty like constrained, right? Like the amount of randomness that went into the outcome of that match. Whereas if it's 0 to 10, that's a much bigger range. And so you're going to end up with a lot more of a variable outcome. And then there's also like that. This is the other thing that like, so there's one thing to do, which is to like tally up all the hits and the misses, right, for the whole match. But that doesn't give you the whole picture, because like, let's say like turn 3, you miss, or you get a 0, or you get a 10. That already like is gonna set off this course that has this like butterfly effect. And we don't know which dice rolls are gonna be the really clutch important ones. So like, let's say, you know, because people will say like, oh, well, you roll the dice, I don't know, 100 times in a match or something, and it kind of like averages out. And like, that's sort of true, but it's less true when you realize also that that each dice roll is not equally important. Some dice rolls are like really clutch. I mean, there might be like a handful, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 dice rolls that are really determinative of the game, especially in a lot of games. And this brings me to my larger point, which is, okay, so let's make a new page here. Like sort of my 2020 randomness thoughts and gem wizards. Oh, let me catch up on the chat a little bit here. But if it's 80% for 5 / 20% for 6, that's variable and not uniform. Well, two things factor into the variability. They both matter. One is the range of possible outcomes, so the numbers, right? So like 5 and 6, that's a small range. And then the other is like the probabilities, as you're talking about. So you could have like a massive range. For example, like let's say the damage range is either 0 or 10,000, right? But you have a, I don't know, like a 99.9% chance of getting 10,000 damage. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, it's not binary. Yeah. So both of those things matter. The probabilities matter in terms of the variability, because ultimately, like, what I care about is at the end of the match, how much free resources or, you know, stolen resources did I not get based on randomness, just pure noise. That's kind of what I care about. So my new thoughts about this are, a lot of the problems with randomness, a lot of the problems I talk about in these games, you know, like what I'm realizing more and more about game design generally is that you know, like any game design theory we come up with is going to be sort of a reaction to what's happening now in games. Like, how do I put it another way? So it's all contextualized, and it's all like has meaning based on what games are like now. And what games are like now are very tactical, very short arc, you know, like these repeating short arcs, tactical arcs that you just got to do and tally them a bunch of times and get a bunch of victory points, or, you know, kill a bunch of bad guys. They're basically the same thing. Deal a lot of damage to the enemy base or whatever. And in those contexts, this stuff matters a lot, because it's just this tallying process. And so if I'm not, it's like literally I'm doing these little loops. Let's write this down, because otherwise it's gonna be hard to follow, I think. In current strategy games, much of whether you win or lose can be determined, or is determined, by a large number of looping tactical wins and losses, right? So like, you know, XCOM or Advance Wars or something, it's really just a matter of like winning these little fights, and then win the next fight, and then win the next fight, and then win the next fight, and then all of a sudden at some arbitrary point the match stops, and there's no more of these tactical loops, right? And so this is kind of what I refer to as like not having long arcs. A lacking of long arcs. But what happens when you have longer arcs involved is that longer arcs, XCOM has long arcs, they're just totally solved and therefore lifeless. Yeah, right. I mean, and also, well, I don't know if you're referring to the longer arcs within a battle or if you're talking about the metagame screen, which also has its own issues. Longer strategic arcs, you know, implemented properly. How do I'm trying to like form my thoughts before I. Actually, it's funny. So there's this old expression, change the meaning of randomness in a game. All right, so here's a way to put it. Output randomness is just input randomness for the next turn. This isn't like a thing that people have like said to me for a long time. It's one of the main objections to the whole phrasing of output randomness and input randomness. There are a lot of designers who sort of reject that dichotomy or that spectrum on these grounds. They're like, what's the difference? It doesn't make a difference. Output randomness is just input randomness for the next turn. So that quote, I think, is false in our current games. Because in our current games, it's all about the local wins, right? And you just have to get enough of these local wins and you win the match. This statement is untrue in our current games because our current games are all about the local victories. And so that would be like just winning a battle in XCOM. Let me think of other kinds of games. Strategy games. In Oro, you know, there would be like an encounter, sort of, with like 4 or 5 enemies and clearing them out. Basically, winning battles is almost always what it is. Actor removal is a big part of this, for sure. I want to put this text in red. But this statement could be true. And I think does become true in a system with a healthy arcosphere or whatever, like there was another term we had for it. A good layering of short, you know, medium, and long arcs. Yeah, arcs in strategy games. This article. So you have like, so here's like just a one single arc of a whole match. This is how most video games are right now. Is just like tallies of like 100, you know, or however many 50 little arcs. And if you did enough of those, then you win. And if you didn't do enough of those, you lose. Or maybe they don't even, it's just a high score thing. And they're like, oh, you won in 30 arcs. Up to you if that's good or not. And then, yeah, so this is with, this is actually how most games look. Tiny arcs looping over and over again. And there is, you know, actually this blue part here is actually being a little bit generous because it's more like this, actually. It's more like this loop is happening and then at some arbitrary point it just ends. Most games don't even really get a large arc like that going, in my opinion. So here's like a little bit more, like a couple of medium arcs. And then, yeah, what happens is that those medium arcs start informing these smaller arcs, and they start changing what these smaller arcs mean, which is cool. And then eventually you start getting this like really interlayered thing. It's actually kind of funny if you know anything about how waveforms work. If you have like two waveforms that overlap over each other, the way that they interact with each other is kind of like this in sound. It's kind of like this, where one waveform will just will push up the amplitude of another waveform, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I did originally want to add longer arcs to Oro. It didn't really work that well. Then I had some ideas how to do that for Alaka Ram, which I still think would work. And maybe at some point we can make that an Oro game mode. Might work. That would be cool. But yeah, so anyway, the point is, with a healthy arcosphere, in fact, let's grab that image real quick. This one right here. Copy image. Yeah, something like that. It could actually, this statement could become true. Which, and I think that's the piece that's sort of been missing. And so anyway, going back to Gem Wizards is intended to have that kind of healthy arcosphere. And therefore, these kinds of randomness, it's not that they don't matter, but the downsides of various kinds of randomness are mitigated a lot. With that said, they still need to be controlled for. Or just say controlled. And to be clear, the randomness in Gem Wizards Tactics is pretty constrained. You know, it's pretty. No more birds. How's it going? We're just talking about randomness and strategy game design. Yeah, I think you made it just in time for the special announcement. We have a world premiere announcement. Keith Burgun Games world premiere. Can't hear it anywhere else. Can you believe it? Holy shit. But yeah. Yeah, this is kind of my thing with Gem Wizards and why there's output randomness. I love these graphics. You have these independent and additive arcs. Yeah. What about multiplicative arc combinations? Well, I think they all should be multiplicative. They all should be interacting with each other and informing each other and contextualizing each other. And actually, you know what's a really good example of not doing this, like really hard not doing this, is the new XCOM Chimera Squad, where literally they put you in a room with, and actually, so looking at it as a tactics puzzle kind of machine, an XCOM Chimera Squad, they put you in a room with your guys and the aliens, and you clear out the aliens. That's a very clear local win. And then you just sort of like teleport into a new room, which has another, series of aliens. And I think that what they're kind of realizing and making that is that this is a tactics game. I've thought the same thing with Oro, which is also a tactics game, that it should really just be a pretty small, constrained area where you just do the tactics win, and it shouldn't be going on for so long. And that's one of the things I want to work on going forward with Oro, is have it be more, shorter. There's no reason for it to be so long, especially in the late game. Once you start reaching like platinum rank, it just starts getting nutty how long it takes to win matches. Chimera Squad's not a very good game, but I love Breaching so much. Tell me more about that. Isn't Breaching the process like you have like a little menu where you pick one of the ways to start the match, basically, which is kind of like a deployment phase in a tactical game, but it's a little bit more discretified or something. Gem Wizard's Tactics is intended to have this kind of healthy arcosphere. Therefore, the downsides of various kinds of randomness are mitigated a lot. With that said, they still need to be controlled. And so yeah, Gem Wizards' output randomness is pretty controlled. It's like, so you get a number that's by totally non-random means first. Your effectiveness or your accuracy or your advantage, I think we're calling it now. I can show you here actually. Yeah. Let me just run the game real quick. I just had a very bad situation in Gem Wizard Tactics last night where I gambled on getting 2 damage, but I got 1. It was already a bad situation. I don't know if that would have helped, but it felt kind of bad. Well, so that's definitely something I want to look at and like think about for sure. Cheating. Okay. So let's see. Oh yeah, this guy's really, yeah, he has a lot of armor. But basically the way it works is you have your attack minus their defense, and you get something called the advantage, your advantage, and then that determines how much damage you're going to deal. And then from there, that's just given an even probability. Basically, if you look at that chart there, 40% to get 3, 20% to get 2 or 4, and 10% to get 1 or 5. And so it's not uniform, but it's coming from a very like the basic thing. The thing that you're likely to get is a very I guess like, you know, deterministic kind of thing. And then if the things that you're not likely to get are only a little bit varied from there. Now there are those situations like No More Birds is talking about. Gambled on getting 2 damage, you got 1. It's already a bad situation, and I don't know if that would have helped. Yeah, I mean, like definitely let's keep an eye on that kind of stuff. But my feeling is 1 damage, long arcs will mean that kind of stuff matters less, right? So like if it's you know, in Advance Wars, if you have something like that happen, it can be just like, okay, it's game over now. You know, like literally I just lost this like tank that was so crucial, and I could have killed this unit with it, and I didn't, and now I'm just like screwed. 1 damage is only important when the enemy has 1 hit point, really. Yeah, but even and even when they do have 1 hit point, it's like, well, then you can probably just kill them with like whatever other unit, right? I mean, in fact, 1 damage. Well, I should also mention, by the way, it's impossible to do 0 damage in this game. If you attack, so this guy, here's a good example actually. The enemy attack is 35. My defense is 35 also. So he actually has 0 advantage, but there's a cap of 1 damage. 1 is the minimum amount that you can do in an attack. So that also constrains the so there's all these constraints on the damage and stuff like that. Another constraint, now this particular bulldozer, he actually cannot retreat, but another constraint typically, so like if I were to move here, this guy can retreat, and so the damage is actually capped at 5. So that's another thing, is let me actually attack somebody even weaker. Oh, but he, hold on, cheating a lot here. All right. Yeah, so see, now here's a good example here. I have 80 attack. The enemy has only 15 defense, pretty weak. So that total 65 advantage. So my normal damage amount that I should do is 6. But this is capped. You can see here, it says here on the text, I don't know if you can read it, but it says capped, and then when you hover over it, it says unit can retreat. Damage capped at 5. So there's all these constraining factors that do constrain, and I recommend doing that kind of stuff. That's helping to make it actually, it's output randomness, but it's more uniform output randomness. Let's see what we got. Boom, 5. Good, I like it. And he retreated, see? That's how that works. Anyways, yeah, back to the thing here. Yeah, so why do I have output randomness at all? I mean, I want to make tactics. So actually the thing that No More Birds talked about, the example, is actually part of what I do kind of want, because I don't want you to just be able to like sort of solve out a tactical encounter. And I think this is actually something that's always been why people have put output randomness in their tactical, that's part of the reason why it's in classical war games, like Advanced Squad Leader or whatever, is because they want, they may be thinking of it as a bit more narrative or, experiential, and that like, I want it to be like, you're this army commander, and in real war, you can't ever guarantee that one little battle skirmish over here on this part of the map is gonna go your way 100% of the time. There's just so many chaos factors in a real life situation that I don't think they're thinking of it as like a strategy game way in the way that I'm thinking of it. But they come to similar conclusions for similar reasons, right? They or for different reasons. Which is they want that kind of like narrative feeling of like a realistic war. Whereas what I want, I don't care about that. What I care about is that your strategy was good. So even if like some of the tactics are, as long as the tactics, now here's the thing. If this is why you need uniform, you need let's see, randomness, input or output, but especially output, should be relatively uniform, because otherwise the amount of variance in the tactics layer can kind of like dominate your strategy layer. Now, the example that No More Birds gave, I don't think that that's happening there. I don't think that that the example of I gambled on getting 2 damage but I got 1, I don't think that's going to throw your whole strategy out the window, right? Like and at least that's the design goal. The intended goal is that yes, there's going to be that noise that's going to complicate, and it's going to add nuance to your strategy. And of course, it's going to be a part of your strategy. It's going to inform your strategy, but it's not going to be like, the tactics is not going to be like the clutch thing. And that's the whole reason for adding output randomness to tactics games in the first place. And that's why it's in Gem Wizards Tactics. So that's pretty much what I have to say on this, but I do want to answer Brick's Parts question, and then we're going to get to the announcement. World premiere announcement. Okay, here's Brick Parts question. Assuming we consider your opponent in a PvP game a source of randomness, how variable or uniform do you think that form of randomness should be? Well, we can't... Okay, so let's talk about that real quick. Opponents, like human opponents, and their randomness. So I've said for a long time that the optimal number of players in a strategy game is 1. That should be the default. All strategy games, like if you're thinking about making a strategy game, you should make a 1-player strategy game unless you have some specific reason why you think you want to make a 2-player game. That reason is probably going to come from outside of the realm of strategy games. Like you're probably you want to make a 2-player strategy game because like you like that feeling of like a head-to-head competitive thing, or like you want to do a tournament with other players, or there's going to be some kind of like social or cultural reason that you would want there to be more than 1 player. So I think that's where I would start. And that might be a whole conversation, but just take it for what it is, that's my opinion. Human opponents are very random, and they're pretty variably random. You know what I mean? Because people are very complicated and weird and hard to predict. They're very hard to predict, especially if they're trying not to get predicted, which they are doing when they're playing a game. So I think that human opponents are very variable random, which is why I don't recommend them. That's one of the main reasons I recommend. It's better if you want to have that kind of like symmetric sort of battle kind of thing. I do think that a two-player strategy game is a strategy game. Yes, but I think it's somewhat harmed by the fact that the source of randomness, another human's brain, is very variable. I mean, they can do all kinds of weird stuff, right? Like you can't predict what they're going to do, and it could be like wildly outside of a range that you would ever predict, right? And so, I mean, I guess another way to answer your last question, Bricks Parts, is that I would say that multiplayer games, that's a better realm for like social games and for cultural games, sports, games that are as much sort of like a ritualistic or social activity than necessarily strategy games proper. And I mean, they can be strategy games as well, but I think that like just what's the reason for adding multiple players? So yeah, I would say that human opponents and their randomness is highly variable and hard to control for as a designer, which is why I recommend one-player strategy games. Let me catch up on Herbivore's comment. The only way to affect that is with what verbs we give players. Oh, I see. In terms of like how to make their input more uniform, but even that's not true really, because like let's say you only give players two options, right? They can only play like left or right each turn. They could just like at the beginning of the game be like, you know what, I'm just gonna play left the whole entire match. And practically speaking, yeah, sure, like most players are gonna just like, do some kind of distribution thing, and the way that Yomi works, and it does somewhat work, is that players, even when they think they're being random, they have patterns, and you can sort of like suss out those patterns a little bit, that kind of thing. 2 options would be more uniform than 10 options, yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, no, it would be. Overall, it would be, yes. Because even with 10 options, somebody could just pick option 1 the whole entire time if they wanted to. Brickspart says, I guess to me, one of the good aspects of a PvP strategy game is that in theory it can be like a dance. Well, yeah, but what is a dance? A dance is a social thing. You do stuff which forces your opponent to adapt and vice versa. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I like 2-player games. I like dancing. I like lots of things. You do stuff with forces your opponent to adapt and vice versa. Yeah, but the problem is that you're playing a strategy game, and you're trying to like do your strategy game stuff, right? And then also your input has to work as a strategy game for the other player. And that's one of the things that's like really strange about multiplayer games, and is why, I don't know, this is kind of hard to talk about. Ideally, it would be pretty cool to have a single player game where the system emergently adapts to what you do. Well, we've talked a little bit about that before. I mean, there are things that, first of all strategy games, one-player strategy games should emergently adapt to what you do is tricky, because like the classical idea of that is the dynamic difficulty adjustment of something like Left 4 Dead. And the problem is you don't want, like, I would say generally No More Birds, like that sounds cool, but it's actually probably not a good idea. Because what that means is that just becomes more rules for the game, right? So like if I go rush, I start rushing, and then they start going defense, it's like, well, I just factor that into that's just a new rule now. You know what I mean? So like, I think that if you follow the logic of that through, it doesn't really make sense. And I think also that strategy games are all about like sort of finding the win windows. And so what you want to have is, and what I try to do in my one-player strategy games is create an uneven sort of like triangle, like where, oh, right now the AI is being a little bit more rushy. Right now the AI is being a little more defensive. They're being a little more econ, and they're kind of like dancing around that. I'm still figuring out some of the details of that with Gem Wizard's Tactics, although some of it's starting to come together for sure. And then the player has to like find those windows, right? It's like, oh, I see where I can be rushy right now, or not, or I made a mistake. I thought I could be rushy here and I couldn't. That kind of thing. Yeah. So human opponents, no good for strategy games. It's just too noisy, and the idea of it's hard enough to make a one player strategy game where the one player's experience is sort of like guaranteed to make sense, and